Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Long time no see. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 1,000 likes on this one. Of course, only drop a like if you feel the video is genuinely deserving of it. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy. Tell someone you love them, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I want them to die. Her voice was little more than a whisper in the still air. There were no more tears, but the tracks were there, catching the moonlight on her skin. The blood had dried black on her swollen lips. I should have stopped her. I thought it then, and I think it now. This was how it began. It was the night of my 10th birthday, July 9th, 1991. The last of the party guests were leaving, family and friends in ones and twos into the late summer night. I had said my goodbyes and snuck into the back garden to play with my new football. We lived near the coast, so the taste of salt was on the air. A stiff breeze off the water cutting through the heat. Upstairs, my younger brother was playing on the computer. Downstairs, my parents tidying and starting dinner. A figure in the distance caught my eye. Dark hair tied back, walking fast through the long grass into the woods. It was a girl I recognized from school, Katie Bridges. We were good friends, but she hadn't come to my party despite being invited. It wasn't really a surprise. Everyone knew how she struggled to get along with the other children. I had plenty of friends, but it often seemed like I was her only one. I watched her until she disappeared into the tree line. Where could she be going alone? I thought. There was nothing out there but hills and forest. "Mom?" I shouted. "I'm going to Katie's. I'll be back in an hour." The lie was easy and, I thought, harmless. I took off before anyone could reply to me, sprinting through the gate and across the grass. I caught up within a few minutes. Katie glanced over her shoulder when she heard me coming. She saw me, but kept on walking. "Go away, Kieran," she said. "Leave me be." "I can't let you go alone," I replied, voice filled with the confidence of youth. I couldn't imagine that anyone wouldn't want my company. "So, where are we going?" I asked, jogging to her side. It was just another afternoon adventure for me. "Nowhere," she said, turning her face away. "Anywhere. Away." That's when I saw she was hurt. A bruise was forming around one eye, a deep cut on her lip, too, which she was trying to keep me from seeing. Blood on her sleeve and the back of her hand where she had wiped it away. I knew what had happened. Her mother had hit her again. Maybe her father. It was equally likely to be either of them. I didn't say anything. I knew from experience she didn't like to talk about what happened. Still, there was a swelling in my chest to say or do anything that might help. She was my friend, wasn't she? But what could I do? In truth, I had no idea. I passed a few moments in awkward deliberation, biting my lip as I kept pace alongside. The least I could do was stay with her until she calmed down, I told myself, then walk her home. So on we went in silence. She wouldn't speak to me despite my best efforts to engage her or raise a smile. We walked for so long I started to worry about getting back. I remember thinking it was strange that we hadn't reached the beach. What direction were we going? I had never thought the forest went on that far. It felt as if we were going downhill too, which made no sense at all. Still, on she marched, eyes down and arms folded, me tagging along while growing increasingly nervous. The trees grew denser, the spaces between them darker. I looked up to see the sky was now overcast. Felt the air growing cold. Katie hadn't seemed to notice any of this. Or she had and didn't care. Just as I was going to suggest turning back, the forest thinned and I saw a clearing ahead. We stepped into it together, a small hollow in the rolling hills, ringed by pale trees with bare branches. There was a stone well in the center, maybe 3.5 feet tall and 5 wide. Behind it rose a wooden statue of an angel with wings outstretched, hands folded in prayer, hooded face looking down. We had both stopped. It was so still and quiet I could hear us breathe. Overhead the clouds rolled past, an ocean of gray stretching as far as I could see. "What is this place?" I said. "Have you been here before?" She didn't reply, but I could tell by her eyes she hadn't. We moved closer, dry grass breaking under our footsteps. I saw the sides of the well were mossy and worn with age. There were other pieces of old stone strewn around us, half-buried remains of some ancient ruin. The angel itself was damp with rot and badly split. Many of the carved feathers had fallen from the wings and lay in the grass. "It's a wishing well," said Katie, walking slowly to the edge. Her eyes were glassy, her voice little more than a whisper. I tried to peer inside without getting too close. "Got a penny?" I asked, forcing a smile as I spoke. The place was scaring me and I didn't want to show it. There was no face under the angel's cowl, just dark wood. Yet I was certain it looked whichever way I moved. Katie had placed her hands on the stone, staring down into the dark. I saw her take a penny from her pocket and hold her hand out over the well. That's when she spoke those words, quiet but clear. "I want them to die," she said. "My parents, I wish they were both dead." She dropped the coin and we watched it fall. A spark of light caught on the metal as it turned. A piece of the sky snatched into the dark, pulled down to vanish in the silence below. There was a flash of wind, a feeling like we had been plunged into icy water. I gasped for breath, shaking with the fear that had been growing in me since we had arrived. We shared a look, then turned and ran together, side by side, back the way we had come. The sun came down as we returned, but it still felt like we had been gone for hours. I recall expecting a rollicking when I got home, but no one said a word. When I burst in the back gate, my brother was still playing on the computer, my parents still tidying and sorting dinner. I checked the clock and found I had been away less than 30 minutes. Had I misread the clock? "That was quick," my mom said as I came in. "Pity Katie couldn't come today. Is she alright?" She gave me a look that said she knew about Katie's problems. Everyone in town did, but nothing ever changed. "Yeah, she's okay," I replied. I didn't tell anyone where I had been with Katie, what we saw, and what was said. Not then, not ever. Katie was woken around 2 a.m. that night. The house was quiet, but she could feel that something was wrong. She sat up in bed and stared at her door. There was a pull in her thoughts, a call telling her to come and look. She crept out into the hallway and peered downstairs. All the doors were closed. She took the first step down, listening. She would be in trouble if her parents caught her out of bed, but she couldn't resist any more than she could resist breathing. There was something down there. She knew. Something she had to see. There was still a light on in the living room, but nothing made a sound. She held her breath and opened the door. Katie's father sat there, still and gray, eyes open and staring. Her mother lay motionless beside him, face down on the carpet. They had both been dead for hours. That's how she told me it happened. There were other stories, but I never wasted my time with them, and neither did the police. The local paper said 2 heart attacks. Katie was taken in by her grandma, a chain smoker in her 60s who had only met her once since she was born. I never learned the details, but Katie's parents had long fallen out of touch with the rest of the family. Still, she was a kind lady, and done everything she could for the girl now in her care. Her own house had been a tiny one-bedroom, so she put it up for sale and moved in with Katie until they could find somewhere suitable. The town pried and watched and gossiped, from the old ladies down to my school friends. It wasn't right, but anyone who has lived in a small town knows how poisonous they can be. I didn't see Katie in person again until a few weeks later. Her grandmother hadn't let her out of her sight since arriving. She came over for lunch, then the two of us sat in the garden. My mom brought us some drinks and tried not to fuss over my friend. Katie waited for my mother to be out of earshot before speaking. "We need to go back," she said. I told another white lie to my mom, said we were going to Katie's as her gran didn't want her away too long. Once we were out of sight of my house, we turned towards the trees, taking the same path we had the night of my birthday. We walked for almost an hour, but couldn't find anything. We kept ending up on the beach no matter which route we took. Katie wanted to keep looking. She was desperate, and I understood why. But I didn't really want to go back there. That place had terrified me, but I couldn't say no to her. So we searched, back and forth over the same ground until we were both filthy and exhausted. We searched until we knew we would be in trouble, and even then she didn't want to go back. She finally gave up when the sun was going down. We took a seat on the hillside overlooking our homes. She had been crying and I hadn't noticed. "Can't tell anyone," she said. "About what happened? About the wish I made?" She was looking down at the ground to hide her face, a tremor in her voice. "Please, Kieran, promise me. Not ever." I didn't hesitate. "I promise," I said. I can touch on this memory only lightly. It is a delicate thing, fragile and perfect, a ghost in glass. I see us sat side by side, gentle clouds above and warm grass below. The only sounds were the distant waves, a rolling whisper in dusk's tender hush. Two children alone on the edge of town, dirty hands and secrets, eyes alive in sunset light. In the weeks that followed, I tried to forget that place, the angel and the well. As enticing as the mystery was, I couldn't deny I was still frightened. Some things are better left in the dark. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be so easy. 2 months after his death, the grave of Katie's father was dug up and the body taken. The same night her house was burnt down with her grandmother inside. They found Katie in the streets, alone, catatonic with shock. I remember that night. The sound of the fire trucks woke me, blue lights flashing as they passed. I got up and went to the window. Where Katie's house would have been was the flickering light of fire. Above it, the black on black of smoke against the sky. My breath fogged the cold glass and I wiped it away. Behind me, my father had entered the room and I hadn't even noticed. He put his hand on my shoulder, but neither of us spoke. Just watched. I could hear the sound of the blaze by then, tearing and eating the building away like some giant animal come alive in the flames. I saw the silhouettes of firemen, saw an ambulance arrive. The beast roared and the roof came down, swallowed into the blaze below. Then my father snatched me up, turning me away from the window and holding me tight like he hadn't for years. Arms wrapped around as if he couldn't keep me safe from all the hurt that waited in the world. No one seemed to know the truth of what happened or why. A veil of secrecy had quickly dropped over the events, which was understandable. The local police, who had never previously been shy of chat and gossip, were suddenly tight-lipped. Even the mention of the Bridges family name drew dark looks. As for Katie, she was taken into social care as she had no remaining family. This meant she had to move into the city, as our small town had not so much as a post office. It was all people talked about, though it seemed to me they cared more about the drama than the girl herself. I actually heard people say she was cursed. They said it like it was a little joke, under their breath. Like it might actually be true and they were afraid to face it. Even my mother, who always had a soft spot for Katie, began to speak about her as if she was something dangerous. As if misfortune was contagious. As if the scared girl, who had come crying to our door when her father broke her arm, was better off gone, best forgotten. I remember looking at the burned remains of her house on my way to school, seeing where the roof had collapsed over her bedroom, and wondering where my friend slept now. Even months later, as autumn faded into winter, people couldn't help but stop and stare when they passed, at the boarded windows and black scars left by the flames, at the pools of rain and fallen leaves scattered among the rubble. The tragedy of it all seemed to have a pull on the whole town, something we couldn't leave behind, the cold ash heart of us. I stayed in touch with Katie despite what people thought or said. My father took the letters I wrote and posted them for me. He never said it aloud, but I think he admired the loyalty to my friend. He and my mother argued over it more than once. I recall listening from my room, ear to the door, when I heard him say to her, "It's up to the boy, and I won't have anyone tell him otherwise." I didn't see Katie face to face again until we were in our 20s. She came back to our town and found a job, rented a flat, said she still felt like it was her home. It had always been her plan to come back, she told me. Through children's homes and foster families, she had always known she would return. We managed to remain friends, but it wasn't the easiest to find time for each other. I had college, a part-time job, family, and a close-knit group of friends. They all seemed wary of her, especially the ones who remembered her from our childhoods. As time passed, Katie built herself a life, working hard and taking her chances where she got them. Within a few years, she started studying law at the closest university. I was so happy for her. I remember meeting her every few months for drinks, my measly life updates paling in comparison to her own. When I was 23, I was driving to the airport with my girlfriend Hazel. We had been seeing each other on and off for a few years. Then in the last month, moved in together. A driver in the opposite lane lost consciousness at the wheel swerving in front of us. It happened too fast for any real thought, just a split-second reaction. I remember Hazel's voice. We were talking about the flight times, then seeing the other car cut across us. A flash of the other driver slumped in his seat, the impact, blurred lights and colors, the car spinning and turning over, then another crash as we came to rest in trees near the road. When I opened my eyes, we were upright, surrounded by greenery. I could hear people shouting nearby. The side of my face was wet and there was broken glass on my clothes and in my hair. As my head cleared, I saw the blood sprayed across the window, saw other small white pieces in my lap. They were teeth and parts of bone, and none of the blood was mine. When we hit the last tree, a branch had come through the passenger window, striking Hazel's jaw and killing her instantly. I am trying, but these are only words, you understand? There are limits to what I can convey with them. Regret, guilt, pain, loss, all those things, and how I hate myself for feeling them. When I survived and she didn't, I can't explain it. Hazel's funeral was the hardest day of my life. I had never really experienced tragedy before. All my family and friends were healthy and well. Katie's parents was the closest I had been to death. People blamed me. I knew it. It wasn't right, but they did. I had been driving and I had walked away without a scratch. They would never say it aloud, but it was all over them. They stank of it. I saw it in their eyes, the way they held themselves, the silence between words. My parents and brother were there for me through it all, but there was only so much they could do. You can't shield someone from all the hurt in the world, no matter how tight you hold them. Afterwards, I told them I wanted to be alone, and they reluctantly obliged. I drank myself stupid, drank until I boiled over, screaming at the walls and the unfairness of it all. At sunset, I pulled on a coat and walked out into the night. It was late autumn and raining heavily, but I didn't care. I knew where I had to go, into the forest by the coast, a coin in my hand. I was looking for a way to fix things. The only way I could think how. I walked the path myself and Katie had when we were 10, through the woods between the hills, head down and wrapped in pain, battered by wind and rain, desperate, crying out inside for a way to make it right. I didn't notice when the rain had stopped, when the air had grown still. It was the trees which caught my attention, those skeletal branches. I stopped. In the failing light, I could see only hills and valleys and forest in all directions. Yes, I thought, this is the way. I put my head back down and kept walking, marching on until the trees parted at last. There it was ahead of me, after all these years. Nothing had changed in all this time. The old stone well, the pale trees, the angel with the hidden face. I thought I could make out the footprints of 2 children in the dirt and leaves. Thought you might be here. I spun around in fright to see Katie, breathing hard, hand on knees. She was soaking wet, wiping strands of hair from across her face. Couldn't let you go alone, she said. The world seemed frozen for a moment. A pause as the pain of the last week rushed up on me. Then the dam broke and I stumbled forward, melting into her arms. All the strength left my body and I sunk to the ground in tears. If you have ever felt like this, you will understand. When it all comes out and you don't care what anyone else sees or hears. I know why you're here, Kieran, she said. It won't work. What? How do you know? I was still drunk, I realized, slurring my words. Because I tried. She looked in my eyes as she spoke. My father. I made a wish here to bring him back, months after he died. But it wasn't him, Kieran. It wasn't my father I brought back. That pull woke me in the middle of the night like before. The urge to go into the dark and see. When I went downstairs, it was there. In the house, sitting where he had sat. Rotting flesh and hollow eyes. It didn't have any teeth. Stomach was bloated. The smell nearly made me vomit. It had already killed my grandmother. I saw her body on the floor. Her voice was cracking, brittle with the memories of her childhood. Then it saw me. It looked at me, Kieran, with those empty eyes, tried to speak, to say my name. When it got up, I panicked and locked myself in my grandmother's room. It was trying to get in the door. I knew I had to fix it. I had to fix the thing I had done. So I used a lighter and lighter fuel from her room to start a fire. Then I climbed out the window, went back to the front door and locked it inside. I didn't know what to say to her. Sat on the cold, dusty soil. Her confession had cleared my head. I don't know how it works. This place. She got to her feet. It isn't always here. You have to want something. Want it more than anything else in the world. It has to be at sunset. You can't look where you are going. You have to keep your head down. I don't know everything you can wish for. Only some of the things you can't. You can't turn back time or make something out of nothing. You can't change. She paused, looking away through the trees. You can't change yourself. How many times did you try? I asked. I don't know. Maybe half a dozen before the night of the fire. I was a child alone with the weight of those things. It was hard to stay away. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Kieran. I just wanted to make it right. I thought of her back then, a 10-year-old girl, life slipping through her fingers. I had no idea what it must have really been like. I know you're hurting, she said. I know it as well as anyone can, but this isn't the way. You don't want that for her. What happened to my father? He wasn't a good man, but he didn't deserve that. What I'd done to him. I rubbed a fallen feather between my fingers, the soft wood breaking apart in my fingers. I knew she was right. This place is evil, Kieran. We both know it. A trap for desperate souls. When I came back to this town, I didn't know if I could find it again. But now that I have, I know it should be destroyed. We should destroy it and never come back. So no one else can be poisoned by it. So we did it. Smashed the well to pieces and dropped the stones down into the dark, not one ever making a sound. When that was done, we covered the hole with hundreds of broken branches stripped from the trees. It must have taken hours. Last, we pushed over the statue. It took us both, rocking it back and forth until it finally tipped. It broke into pieces as it hit the ground, each rolling away into the dust. We didn't look back, just left together in silence. When we reached sight of home, we parted without a word. I had nightmares for months afterward, something I never suffered from before or since. I would wake up screaming for help, not knowing who or where I was. The things I saw in those dreams have never left me. A faceless girl floating on a bottomless ocean, body tattooed with black words and symbols. There are hands just beneath the surface, thousands, millions of them reaching for her, then angels in a cold desert, surrounding a pit in the earth. They pull each other's bodies apart and drop the pieces into the silent void below. They are screaming, but no sound comes, only the parts of them falling, always falling, tiny lights vanishing into nothing. I didn't see Katie often in the months that followed. It wasn't her fault, but she brought back too many difficult memories. I moved away from the town for several years, but could never settle. One morning I woke up simply knowing I had to go home. I had to be with my family and friends. My brother's wedding wasn't long after I returned. I saw Katie at the reception that night, sat alone on the steps outside the venue, champagne in one hand and cigarette in the other. Despite her success, she still wasn't great at making friends. She turned to see me as I walked towards her. We hadn't spoken in years, but she smiled, took my hand to help her up. Then we were face to face, alone in the moonlit night. The sound of music and dancing inside seemed to melt away until there was only us together. We kissed, wrapped in the night and each other, as if from nothing. My life changed in that moment, finding something I never knew I needed. We spent the night together, then another. She moved into my flat the next month, and we were engaged in the weeks after that. No one else approved, but it didn't matter. We had never let each other go. Not really. Even when the world didn't want her, I always would. I believed I had learned a lesson, to realize what you have and hold it close. Everyone has hopes and fears. Everyone has their wishes and their demons. Can you hear yours now? Do you listen to what they say? Some can give you hope and drive you on. Some fill your hearts with the things you have lost or will never have. The trick is to learn which are which. I need to skip on years again. So many it makes me feel old to write it. The world has started to feel shallower as I age. Smaller, narrower. There is less color, I think. Katie has a wonderful career. We have a beautiful home together and a good life. I'm her husband, though I sometimes wonder what else. Somewhere along the way I lost my ambition and drive. I've been feeling uneasy for a long time now. It has been growing beneath the surface of our lives. Last night I couldn't shake it, couldn't get my thoughts away from it. I was staring at the door, a pull in my chest, something telling me to come and look. Katie had told me she was going to meet a friend for a few hours. She often did, and I had never thought anything of it. It was sunset. On the horizon, great clouds rolled in from the ocean, dark giants embracing the land. I followed her footsteps in the mud, though I didn't need to. I knew where I was going, driven by fear like a fire in the night. I walked on, head down. The air grew still and quiet, the trees thin and pale. I saw it ahead of me. The hollow, the well and statue were there, standing just as they had been when I first laid eyes on them. A path was worn into the dry grass. Katie was there. She sat on the edge of the well, looking down into the black. "Knew you would figure it out eventually," she said. Now that I had arrived, I didn't know what to say. "I couldn't stop," she said. "I couldn't stop trying to make things better, but I made mistakes. Mistakes I couldn't fix. It was like a fire I couldn't put out." I stood there in the dust, hearing the truth I already knew. There were no twists or tricks or hidden evils. I got exactly what I wished for every time, and it ate me away. Now nothing is right, nothing is clean. Everything I have left is poisoned by it. I'm empty, can't you see, Kieran? Everything I have is worthless. She looked me in the eyes, and I could see it at last. All the years of lies and fear. I could never fix my mistakes, no matter how hard I tried, she said. I wish for my father to come home. I wish for people to notice me, to care about me, but all I did was make them hate me. I wished. Her voice cracked and she hung her head, closed her eyes. Tears rushed down her cheeks and fell into the dark. So many wishes for things I wanted ended up hurting people. I wanted you. I always wanted you. So I wished that you loved me. But it isn't real, is it? Because you never had a choice, so it isn't really you. And now it can never be real. And that's my fault too. She didn't look at me, didn't even open her eyes. She just pushed forward and was gone, vanishing into the silence of the night below. I should have stopped her. I thought it then, and I think it now. This was how it ended. Now I long for something lost. There are no answers in this pain, no truth to find. It is just another broken piece of Minnie. I close my eyes and here she is. Eyes and voice and lies and fear. How much of my life was my own? Which decisions were forced upon me by the wishes she made? Did I have no choice in the woman I loved? If I can't trust myself, then what remains to me? What is left to believe in? I know she didn't need to make that wish. She didn't need to ask for something that was already hers. All she had to do was tell me. Because I've always loved her, and I always will. Whatever is after this life, I know she still needs me. So I know what I have to do. I can't let her go alone. I'm a PhD student living somewhere in Eastern Europe. Sorry about being a bit ambiguous, it's just that I'm a little uncomfortable about sharing some details. I'm a quiet and mellow guy, so I've been looking for a place to stay where I wouldn't be bothered by noise or have to deal with messy housemates. I lived for about a year somewhere pretty close to university, sharing an apartment with a housemate. Things were alright in the beginning, but I eventually decided to move out due to my noisy housemate. He'd often party until 4 to 5 a.m., which drove me up the wall, since I'm also dealing with insomnia and have nightmares pretty often. I find it hard to sleep even during quiet nights. Having someone blasting music at 4 a.m. in the next room is just hell for me. I know I might not be the life of the party, but the 4 a.m. party definitely is the death of me. About 2 months ago, on one of these sleepless nights, I decided enough was enough, so I looked up apartments around the city. In just a couple of hours, I've found this nice offer. A cheap and cozy room in a 3-room apartment, a few bus stops away from university. The post was made by some young girl. I decided to check the place out. I was greeted by the young girl that posted the offer. She spoke with a foreign accent and she'd often avoid eye contact. Maybe she was shy. Regardless, she showed me around the place. Let's call her Nadia. The place looked alright, not to mention that the landlord was living on the same floor, so that would guarantee it would be quiet. The landlord was some old guy that didn't even bother to show up. Nadia told me she's usually dealing with the new tenants that move in, and the landlord is just showing up once a month to collect the rent. I asked her when can I move in. She told me that the guy that was living in that room will move out in a couple of days. Before leaving, instead of heading towards the exit, I accidentally turned towards one of the rooms, moving my hand to reach the door handle. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. I realized I forgot which direction the entrance door was, and I was trying to open the door of her bedroom. I apologized, saying that I'm no Magellan or Columbus, that's for sure. We both laughed about it and shrugged it off. Come to think of it, Nadia seemed a bit scared, seeing me head towards her bedroom. I can't blame her. It would be pretty weird to see a stranger you've just met trying to enter your room. I didn't give it too much thought. The following week, I moved in. I figured I'd bring a bottle of wine, having a drink with my new housemates. There was another girl living there. I'll call her Lydia. She was a few years younger than us, while Nadia was about my age. Both of them were university students, so we chatted for a couple of hours, joked, decided to play Macau for a short while. It's a popular card game here. I think it's also called Crazy Eights. Anyway, every now and then, I'd get up from the table going to the bathroom. The weird thing was, every time I headed for the bathroom, Nadia would also get up and step into the hallway. She'd just stand there, looking at me as I headed for the bathroom. The second time it happened, I turned around and asked if everything is all right. She just nodded, following with an anxious, "Yeah." I thought it was pretty weird. Then it hit me. She was looking towards the door of her bedroom. My first thought was to ask her about it so I can assure her that I'm not going to invade her privacy or anything. I changed my mind, not wanting to creep her out or make her feel even more uncomfortable, so I just ignored her, heading for the bathroom. After a few weeks of restless sleep, I finally managed to get some proper rest. It felt good to be in a new home. Nadia was a bit weird, but all in all, she seemed like a good girl. Lydia was also very nice. To be fair, we didn't really spend a lot of time together, most of the time. We'd each just do our own thing. In a funny way, each of us was a ghost that would haunt the other two. We'd bump into each other now and then, either in the kitchen or in the hallway, say hello to one another, then move on. A couple weeks later, I had a nightmare. In my dream, I was running away from something I couldn't see clearly. In some dark, snowy forest, the entity made a weird noise which actually prompted me to wake up. I was startled, but I returned to sleep shortly after. These kinds of dreams are pretty common for me, so I'm used to them. Early in the morning, I went to the bathroom hearing a subtle sound coming from Nadia's room. It sounded like a humming voice. What was she doing? I thought she might be humming a song or something like that. Since I figured out she's awake, I knocked on her door. We didn't get any hot water that morning, so I wanted to ask her if she knows anything about that. She didn't respond. I knocked again. No answer. I figured out she's busy, or she didn't want to chat to me, so I let her be. I went to the kitchen to grab a bite. Just a short while later, Nadia enters the kitchen, asking me why I was knocking. I told her about the hot water and she responded, "Don't worry, things will get back to normal soon." Even though she was clearly talking about the water, I felt a bit bothered by her answer. Something felt off. It's almost as if she wasn't talking about the hot water, but something completely different. Nadia left the kitchen and I followed shortly after. We were both headed for our rooms. I reached my room and opened the door. Then Nadia reached her room and suddenly stopped. She was standing there in front of the door without saying anything. I asked her if there's a problem. She didn't respond. I insisted. She turned around, just looking at me, expressionless. I just apologized and entered my room. As soon as I closed the door, I've heard the door to her room opening and closing. I was starting to worry about her. She seemed worried and on edge. I thought she might be under a lot of stress or something bad happened to her. We hardly knew each other, so I didn't know how I could help her. I spoke to Lydia, and she told me she didn't know a lot about Nadia either. She noticed the weird behavior and the humming too. She had no clue. She seemed a bit creeped out by Nadia. So I comforted her. I told her that maybe Nadia is a little troubled or stressed. A few days later, the landlord showed up to collect the rent. I was home alone, but Lydia left me the rent money. Nadia said she already paid rent, so the landlord will only ask for our money. After paying up, I asked the landowner if he knows anything about Nadia. The old man says he thinks she's a bit shy and might not know how hard life can be. He also told me that a lot of 20-year-olds are like that, but they'll grow out of it once they get used to life in a new city. That didn't really help. The old man likely didn't care about the tenants that much. He was just there to collect the rent. Fair enough. The next weeks went by. Pretty monotone and repetitive. At least during daytime. During evenings and early in the mornings, I'd sometimes hear the humming coming from Nadia's room. I've also had another nightmare. In this one, I was in my apartment and I could see that creepy silhouette from my previous nightmare in the hallway. This time, she was more detailed. She had a slim figure. She was somewhat foggy and her eyes were glowing. Her eyes were two round, green circles, glowing into the dark. I couldn't make out any other details. I suddenly woke up just like last time. Had a look around the apartment to calm myself down. Nothing unusual, as I've previously said. The days went by without anything too eventful happening. However, there was one thing that kept bothering me. I kept thinking about it and the thought wouldn't leave me alone. The thing the landlord said, he said that a lot of 20-year-olds are like Nadia. Nadia was the same age as me. We were both 24. Lydia was 20. I figured out I'd bring it up next time we talk. When the rent day came up, he called me, telling me that he's out of town and he'll be back to collect the rent in 2 days. After a short while, I asked the landowner the same question just like last time. He asked me if I'm into Nadia, and suggested me to ask her out. I told him that's not the case and I'm a little worried about her well-being. He mentioned the 20-year-old thing again, so I corrected him, explaining that Lydia's the one that's 20. He apologized, saying that he got Lydia's name wrong. I followed by saying that Nadia is actually 24. He paused for a few seconds without saying anything. "Did I say anything wrong?" I asked. He stood silent for a few seconds. I thought he hung up. Then he asked me, "Who's Nadia?" His question, so filled with confusion and concern, shook me. I reminded him that Nadia is one of the tenants. He told me that he knows that, saying she's the 20-year-old girl. I told him again that the younger girl is named Lydia, and Nadia is the 24-year-old girl. He sounded annoyed over the phone, saying that he's celebrating his brother's birthday and he's not in the mood for stupid pranks. He angrily told me that he'll be back for the rent in 2 days, then he hung up. This didn't make any sense. I called him back immediately, trying to figure out what's going on. He wouldn't answer. He was angry. Lydia was in her room chatting with a friend over the phone. I didn't feel like telling her since she's easily freaked out. I figured out it wouldn't make much sense to scare her for no good reason. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the old man is diagnosed with dementia, and he has difficulties remembering some things. He didn't seem to remember my name either, but he didn't really present the symptoms of a patient with dementia. Maybe he was drunk, although he didn't really sound like it. Then it hit me. Could Nadia be an illegal tenant? No, that would be stupid. It wouldn't make any sense. I decided I'd have to ask Lydia something, but I chose my words carefully so I wouldn't freak her out. I asked her if she noticed anything weird about the landowner before I moved in. She told me something pretty unsettling. The landowner told her something among the following lines. "You two are by far the best tenants I've had." This didn't add up. Before I moved in, there were 3 people here. Lydia, Nadia, and the guy that moved out. I joked that the old man might be better at counting money than people. Then Lydia just forgot about it. I figured the only way to solve this was to confront Nadia directly when she got home. Somewhere around 11 p.m. she showed up. I opened the door and stepped outside. She stood there in the hallway next to the entrance without saying anything. I said, "Good evening." She didn't say anything. I decided to break the silence and confronted her directly. "Nadia, the landowner said he'll be back in 2 days to collect the rent." She stood there repeating my last words. "Collect the rent." I followed it with, "He said he doesn't know who you are. What's going on here?" As the situation got so tense, I didn't even realize that I forgot to turn on the light in the hallway. After flicking the switch, I saw that Nadia had her palms over her face. I didn't understand what was going on. Then I heard it, her humming. I asked her, "Why do you do that?" She ignored me and started humming louder. Then her humming turned into a grunt, and the grunt turned into a scream. The scream grew louder and louder. Suddenly the light went out. Nadia was screaming so loudly it was hurting my ears. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I pointed it towards Nadia. That wasn't Nadia. I didn't know what I was seeing, but that was not Nadia. I immediately took a step back, entered my room and slammed the door and locked it. I grabbed a dumbbell that was sitting on the ground and armed myself. The humming started again. Then came the grunt, then the scream, then the louder scream. I was horrified, but I still remembered about Lydia. What if Nadia would go and hurt her? Lydia was probably still in her room. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking violently, and called the police. I whispered, barely being able to speak, the address and told them to come quickly. Then I heard a loud tapping sound against the door. Then I could hear her screams again. Then I heard some horrible scratching noises. I was frightened and stood there without moving, holding the dumbbell in my right hand, prepared to attack should she enter my room. Then it stopped. It went quiet. It seemed as if she went away, almost as if she vanished. I wouldn't dare step outside the bedroom. What if it was just an ambush? I decided to wait for the police to show up. I could barely hear Lydia sobbing in her room. I wanted to unlock the door and go and help her, but I was afraid Nadia might still be there. I yelled, announcing Lydia that the police are on their way. I told her to stay put. About 10, maybe 12 minutes later, the police came. As soon as they reached my door, I stepped outside, relieved. Lydia did the same, crying and shaking violently. I hugged her, trying to comfort her. Although I could hardly control myself, I turned around and I jumped, seeing the scratches on my door. A woman's nails couldn't have made those scratches. They looked more like something that would be left by a knife that was scratched against the door. I thought that Nadia might have been armed. Who knows what she could do? The police officers told us that they didn't see anyone outside or in the staircase. Eventually, we told them what happened. They told us to stay put as they had to check Nadia's room. They kicked the door, their sidearms ready, but nobody could have prepared us for what we saw. Behind the door, there was just a cupboard. A narrow space filled with brooms and cleaning products covered in dust. This didn't make any sense. Where did Nadia live? What was going on here? The police searched the area and helped us calm down. We went to the station and told them everything that happened. It was confusing and it shook them as well. Nothing made any sense. The landowner was just as shocked when he returned and found out about the whole ordeal. Apparently he never knew of this third tenant. We talked about it for hours trying to make sense of what happened. The whole event left us puzzled and traumatized. Both Lydia and I moved out after a few days. We shared the same bedroom for a while before parting ways. She revealed to me that she also had nightmares during some nights. She'd also describe a dark silhouette in a snowy forest. Well, I didn't want to share one particular detail. That horrifying night, when I pointed my flashlight towards Nadia, I didn't want to believe it. Or, more likely, I tried to forget about it. But her eyes were glowing green. Being an Uber driver was not a career choice. It wasn't something I wanted to do long term. It was just a means of making money, and considering the current climate, I needed it. I lived alone and I didn't really have that many friends. I was pretty lonely. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed my own company, but there is a stark difference in being alone and feeling lonely. I figured picking up random strangers in my car every night would alleviate that loneliness in a way. My clientele varied day to day, but a lot of my passengers were inebriated, rowdy, and excreting bodily fluids I didn't even know existed. I found myself cleaning up vomit more times than I would have liked, but it wasn't always the case. I wasn't much of a talker, so I never struck up a conversation with any of my customers, save for asking them what their name was and where they were going to confirm I had collected the right person. I found that most of the people I chauffeured preferred it that way. You'll find that people always yearn for an ear to chew off. Everyone wants to be heard, even if it is by their Uber driver. I guess people may view it as a form of therapy, detailing your problems to someone who doesn't know you and may offer an unbiased opinion should you need it. That's how I looked at it anyway. That's not what I'm here to talk about, though. I'm not here to disclose the things that people shared with me. Those stories are irrelevant, and it isn't my place to do that. I'm here to tell a different story. I'm here to tell a story that I cannot explain. A terrifying and haunting encounter. Now, I will start this off by saying that I had never once felt threatened whilst doing my job. I had never felt fear, nor had I ever felt like my life was at risk. Mostly the job was just that. A job. Uneventful and ordinary until that night. I had started work around 8 p.m. that evening, and I remember it being fairly quiet with not many customers. After about an hour, I was just about ready to head back when my phone started to ping. I perused at the request and decided that I was going to do this last job before heading home. The pickup and destination were not that far between, so I figured it would take me 20 minutes to do the trip. When I pulled up, the street was eerily silent, which was quite unusual for that time of night. It was only 9:15 p.m., so the stillness was peculiar. It made me feel somewhat uneasy, but I shoved those feelings aside, deeming them ridiculous and unnecessary. I observed the house that stood before me. It looked really old, older than any house I had seen before. Its shadowy and vast presence was menacing, and I remember my heart rate elevating as I sat waiting. I took a deep breath and calmed myself down. It's just a house, I thought to myself and chuckled. The front door opened and I found myself holding my breath as I watched the figure step out into the night. It was a man wearing an ill-fitted gray suit that draped over him like a curtain, loose and flowy. His face was partially obscured by a cap, and all I could see was his mouth, which appeared to be curled into a small smile, thinning his lips. He looked odd. That's the best way I could describe it. There was just something slightly off about the way he looked, and I couldn't quite place my finger on it. I thought perhaps it was the suit and cap combination. The utter strangeness of it, but it was more than that. His whole persona just gave me the creeps, even down to the way that he walked. As he approached my car, I noted he walked with a slight limp, which made him drag his left leg. But even as he put one foot in front of the other, I noticed the odd way in which he was moving his body, stunted and robotic. You could say he resembled a child that was just learning to walk. He stopped in front of my car and made no attempt to get in. I looked up at him and saw the same small smile lining his lips. It wasn't menacing, but it was creepy. I could see the side of his mouth quivering as he stood there unmoving. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window and spoke. "Hey mate, you ordered an Uber?" I asked. I watched as the man's entire body stiffened at the sound of my voice. He tilted his head toward me and nodded slightly. I still couldn't see his face. "All right, hop in," I said, attempting to make my voice sound as cheerful as I could. The man slowly opened the door of the passenger seat and climbed in. As soon as he shut the door, I felt the air in the car change. It became thick, blistering, and almost unbreathable. I rolled down my window and took a lungful of air before pulling out into the quiet road. I wanted to get to his destination as fast as possible. We drove in silence for a while, and I had almost forgotten that eerie and uncomfortable feeling. I checked my phone, and according to the sat-nav on the Uber app, we were 10 minutes out. I looked around, and that was when my heart sank. We hadn't left the streets. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself. Had I just driven around in a circle and not realized? I looked up in the interior rearview mirror and saw the man staring at me. His eyes were still obscured by the cap, but I knew he was looking right at me. His mouth still bore that slight smile, only this time it seemed a little wider. His skin was the color of ash, sullen and thin like moistened paper. It looked like it would rip at the slightest touch. Maybe there was a simple explanation for why we were still on the same street. Maybe I had gone in a circle without realizing. Sometimes these roads all look the same. I moved off and made sure that I turned the left corner this time. We drove for about 5 minutes before I saw the house again. Was this some kind of prank? I thought. I was beginning to sweat profusely, and I could feel my heart beating against my chest like a drum. I stopped the car and got out. The street was eerily silent, devoid of any signs of life. It was as if the world had frozen in time. The unnerving atmosphere sent shivers down my spine, and I became increasingly anxious to get away. As I turned around, my heart sank to see the man had also gotten out of my car. He stood on the other side, his eyes obscured from view, but I could sense his intense stare piercing through me. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked him, hearing the terror in my own voice. He didn't respond, just continued staring at me. Then his mouth began to quiver and twitch more violently, the sides jolting and trembling, forming a detestable, maniacal smile. It continued to stretch from ear to ear, growing wider and wider. It was impossible, and yet it continued to get bigger, exposing his crooked, discolored teeth. I watched as the skin around his mouth grew taut, slowly ripping at the sides like the seams on a frayed shirt. Droplets of blood trickled down, saturating his teeth. The smile continued to grow, distorting the features on his face. "What do you want from me?" I managed to say. "Look into my eyes." I'd never seen anyone move so fast. He scampered towards me, his limbs splaying from one side to the other, moving in an unnatural fashion. He looked like a puppet being controlled by a maniac you couldn't see. I looked at his face. His smile never once left his crimson-colored lips. It had now extended to the back of his head, all the way around. "Look into my eyes," he said again, crawling towards me on all fours. I stepped back hastily, reluctant to take my eyes off him. I scanned my surroundings frantically, searching for a way out, but there seemed to be none. Darkness enveloped me from all sides, and a sense of dread and hopelessness gnawed at my insides. Was I going to die here? "Just look into my eyes. I promise everything will be okay after you look," he said. I looked at him, and that was when I knew. I never wanted to know what his eyes looked like. I knew that something awful was going to happen to me if I did. "Look into my eyes. Look into my eyes." He kept repeating it over and over. His mouth grew impossibly large, the jaw scraping and dragging across the floor as he spoke. His tongue slithered out aimlessly like the tongue of a snake. It flicked from side to side, speckles of bloodied spit flew across the ground, staining my shoes. As he slowly rose to his feet, his jaw returned to its normal position, but his sickening smile remained. His face appeared deflated like a balloon, marked by deep creases and folds. It was the first time I could clearly see his features. He lifted his left arm, which appeared skeletal and dry, to remove his cap. "Look into my eyes," he repeated, his voice barely audible but firm and demanding. He removed his cap, revealing his full face. My heart raced so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Now you will see," he groaned. That was enough for me. I ran back to my car as fast as I could with my eyes closed. I knew I had to get away, and I wasn't sure if I could leave this road, but I had to try. Once in the car, I avoided the rearview mirror at all costs and pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could, feeling the car roar to life. I drove for miles until I was sure I had escaped. I still don't know what that man was or what he wanted from me, but one thing is certain. I quit my job as an Uber driver the very next day. Ever since that night, I've been struggling to sleep. I can't tell if it's the anxiety or what I experienced or the fear of falling asleep. Every night when I close my eyes, I can hear a faint whisper, hauntingly gentle but disturbingly determined. "You did as I asked, and now there's no turning back." I was 10 when I told my mom about the pale lady in the wardrobe. She had long limbs and paper white skin. She killed Marlene, my babysitter, right in front of me. And I watched as she dragged Marlene's body into the wardrobe. She smiled at me as she climbed in after her. I told Mom everything. I told her to get help and call the police. We could save her if we tried. We could help Marlene. But Mom didn't believe me, nor did she care. Mom was very drunk and relieved she didn't have to pay Marlene for watching me. She waved me away and pulled the man she had brought back into her room. She closed the door in my face. She believes now, though. Oh, yes, she does. But too little, too late. It should have been her. I'm upset and scared, but more than anything, I'm pissed. My mother's subordinates has irrevocably broken so many people. My baby sister is the biggest victim of it all. I know we won't ever find her. As I've said before, Marlene was my babysitter. She was very nice and also very dumb. She once asked me what the Spanish word for tortilla was. Mom loved to date almost as much as she loved to drink. Almost. Is it sad to say that I saw Marlene more than Mom? If so, too bad, because it's the truth. Mom was on another date that night. She told us not to wait up for her. Marlene and I were watching TV in the living room. She had put a frozen pizza in the oven and went to check on it. She was in the kitchen for less than a minute when she began to scream. I jumped to my feet. my heart beating so hard it hurt. Marlene ran into the room. Her eyes were wide and terrified. "Run," she shrieked at me. "Maria, run." My feet didn't want to move. Fear glued me to the floor. Marlene grabbed me around the waist, and we ran out the front door. There was no moon and barely any stars. Everything was black. I had regained my ability to move. I ran fast, and so did Marlene. We had nearly reached Marlene's car when I looked back and I saw her. It was a woman. She unfurled herself from the house, limbs dangling. She had to be at least 10 feet tall, and her pale skin gleamed in the dark. It didn't take her long to catch up to us, but it should have been me. Marlene pushed me hard and I fell to the ground. She saved me, and I could only watch as the woman grabbed her and took her back inside the house. Marlene screamed so loud for so long, but it didn't matter. Mom and I lived on a street full of rotting, empty houses. There was nobody but us. The woman must have lived in the house all along, and when we moved in, we were the trespassers. We were encroaching on her territory. The last time I saw, Marlene was as the woman took her into the wardrobe. She wasn't screaming anymore, but blood was running from her nose. Her eyes were full of tears. I watched her, and she watched me. They never found Marlene. It's not as though they really looked for her. Her home was as broken as mine was. I dreamed of Marlene often. I dreamed that I watched as the woman held her in her fist and squeezed. I listened to her bones crunch and saw her intestines spill out of her mouth. Brain matter leaked out of her ears, and her eyes formed gelatinous tears on her cheeks. She had cared for and saved me. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for her. I looked for her every day until the day I left for college. I never found any trace of her. I saw traces of the woman, though. Occasionally, I would glimpse her from the corner of my eyes. Her long arms would creep into the room and then slither out of sight. Once I saw her reflection in the mirror as I brushed my teeth. She only appeared when Mom was out of the house, so I made sure never to be home alone. When I moved out, I moved across the country. I barely talked to Mom. However, I spoke to Lizzie, my baby sister. Mom became pregnant with her when I was 17. I begged Mom to move repeatedly, but she never listened to me. Lizzie was 10. I told her about the house, but never about the pale lady. I told her never to be alone, and she listened. She had been safe. But Mom had gone to the bar during the night, and when she came home, Lizzie was gone. There were claw marks on the door and a dark stain on the bed. The wardrobe was partially askew. It had happened. The woman had taken her. Mom was drunk and half crazy in grief. She asked me what to do. "Call the cops and look in the wardrobe," I told her. "Find her. It might not be too late." She did and called back a moment later. "They said they're on the way," she sobbed. "Good. Are you by the wardrobe?" Yes. Maria, her sock is on the floor. It's drenched with blood. Maria, you were right. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I hung up on her. I replayed the last conversation I had with my sister in my head. It would haunt me forever. "Maria?" Lizzie whispered to me over the phone. "Maria, Mom's gone." "What do you mean she's gone? It's almost midnight." "I know. I woke up to go to the bathroom and she's not here." Lizzie was near tears. I tried to stay calm for her, but it was hard. I felt dread crawling over my skin like a spider. "I think she went to the bar again. She's been drinking a lot." This was bad. Where are you? I asked. I already knew. In the house? Lizzie whimpered. In the house alone. Lizzie, get out of the house now. Run. Run until you're on the next street over. No, run until you reach the bar. There should be people there. I'm on my way. I'm going to book a flight right now. I'm taking you to live with me. It sounded so easy. A fantastic plan. It would be okay. It would be fine. I would fly to my sister and bring her back with me. Everything would be okay, but it was too late. Fear immobilized Lizzie as it had with me all those years ago. I hear something, she whispered to me. There's something right outside the door. Mom? I said, hopefully knowing that it wasn't. No. Lizzie breathed, and her voice sounded muffled. It's not Mom. I'm under the bed right now. It's a woman. She's whispering to me. She gasped. She's in the room. She's talking to me. I couldn't say anything. I burst into tears. Lizzie was crying too. She says she remembers you. She remembers hearing you scream and pound on the door. She says that every day you would walk around the house looking for the girl. The one she killed. Lizzie, stop talking, I yelled. Lizzie, I'm on my way. I grabbed my keys and ran to the door. Yes, I was in my pajamas, and yes, I was thousands of miles away, but I could save her. I could help my sister. I could help her like Marlene had helped me. It was quiet, and when Lizzie spoke again, her voice was strangely calm. She says that she watched you every single day in every single room. She says that you think you got away, but you didn't. She says she'll see you soon. You can tell when you're being watched. There's nothing to actually prove this, but everyone knows it's true. And as I crept my way through the woods, rifle in hand, I knew there was something else with me. I'd been out in the woods on weekend hunting trips for years, and this wasn't the first time I had felt this way. Usually it just meant I had been noticed by whatever critter I had set my sights on, though on one occasion my observer happened to be a rather irritable grizzly bear. This time, however, felt different. I stopped moving and peered around, trying to locate my unseen watcher. I scanned the trees carefully, wondering if perhaps I was just being paranoid. Everything was still, quiet, but the feeling remained. The gaze didn't feel hostile, like the staring of a predator stalking prey. Instead it felt, well, I guess curious, I suppose, is how to best describe it. Like a child staring at you on the subway because you are dressed funny. After a few moments, I heard a soft noise somewhere in the distance, something not unlike the sounds of a set of wind chimes in the breeze, but not quite right. I turned to look, but saw nothing but a flutter of leaves. The sensation of being observed subsided, and I continued on my path, trying my best to shrug it off. At the time, I figured it must have been a fellow hunter, maybe wearing camouflage. It explained why I didn't see them, and why the gaze didn't feel dangerous, but I couldn't quite put my finger on the sound I'd heard. For some reason, that noise bothered me, and I didn't understand why. Eventually, I reached the hunting blind I'd set up deep in the woods and settled in for a few hours of watchful relaxation. I'd brought a book with me so I wouldn't get too bored, though I needed to make sure I looked up from time to time lest a whole herd of deer appear right under my nose. I sat there in silence for a while, maybe an hour or two. It was peaceful that deep out in the forest. utterly tranquil. Part of why I went hunting was to get in touch with the sublimity of nature, to experience isolation from the busyness and squalor of urban life. It was pleasant to be alone with only trees and birds for company. I was pondering this when suddenly I heard a twig snap. I put down my book quietly and looked out of my hunting blind, searching for the source of the sound. After a few moments of scanning the trees, I saw my target. It was a buck with a magnificent rack of antlers. 10 points at least and perfectly symmetrical. I'm not usually one for trophy hunting. I'm generally just in it for the meat and as an excuse to be outdoors, but even I was impressed. I figured at the very least they'd look good above my mantle. I raised my rifle and took aim through the scope, lining up the shot just right. I wasn't in any hurry. It hadn't seen me, so I had plenty of time to steady my breathing and place the buck's head squarely in my crosshairs. It would have been a clean kill, an instant, painless death. That's when I got that feeling again. I knew I was being watched. I could tell it was the same observer from earlier. I guess you could say the vibes were similar, but the intentions were different. Before, whatever was watching me had simply been curious, but now it felt angry, like it was jealous. The buck noticed something was wrong, too. Its ears picked up, and it started to look around nervously. I knew that I had to take the shot right then, or else I wouldn't have another chance. It was about to bolt. But something held me back. I heard that faint sound of something almost like wind chimes from behind me, and I closed my eyes and set down my rifle. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I sure as hell knew I didn't want to see it. This decision may have saved my life. The chimes grew louder and closer, mixed in with the sound of rushing wind. Whatever it was, it moved as quickly as a freight train. I heard it move past me like the rush of waves against the beach, the pseudo-musical chiming reaching an almost unbearable volume. I heard the buck cry out for a split second before its scream was silenced with one of the most bizarre noises I've ever heard. I can't even hope to describe it accurately. It was something between a slab of gelatin being pushed into a paper shredder and a crystal chandelier crashing to the floor. But even that doesn't fully do the hellish cacophony justice. It was so loud it made my ears ring, and it was followed by such intense silence that I swear I thought I had gone deaf. The whole forest had gone silent, as if every living thing was too scared to make a sound. Eventually, after the silence had passed and the birds started chirping again, I opened my eyes. There was nothing there. No buck, no blood, no drag marks. Nothing. It was as if it had never existed at all. It was going to get dark soon, so I quickly left the blind, hiking as quickly as possible back to camp, perhaps a tad faster than was strictly necessary. I kept listening intensely, horrified that I would hear the sound of something not quite like wind chimes coming towards me. Finally, I reached my tent. I was tempted to just pack up my gear and hightail it back to my truck, but by this point it was so dark that I feared I would get lost if I did so. Instead, I simply slipped into my tent and got inside, fully clothed with my loaded rifle next to me. I didn't sleep at all that night. At some point around 2 or 3 a.m., I felt a presence outside my tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and that feeling of being watched came back in full force. After a few minutes of this, I faintly detected that sound of the almost wind chimes, very quiet, from outside. I clutched my rifle with white knuckles, not wanting to go down without a fight. The chiming increased in intensity for a moment, followed by a loud, wet thump. Then the not quiet wind chimes faded into the distance, and the paranoid sensation of being observed abruptly vanished. I still didn't leave my tent until the sun came out. I sat alone, terrified that the thing would come back, until the first rays of sunlight peeked through the fabric of the tent. I know it's childish, but I felt safer in daylight. As I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, I detected a strange door, almost like ozone. As I hastily began packing my things to leave, I stepped in something which I quickly concluded must have been the source of the smell. It was a slimy pile of what looked like white and gray strings on the ground, along with a rounded object about the size of my fist, with the texture like undercooked noodles. I had no idea what I was looking at, until I noticed the two small orbs connected to the rounded object with white strands. Eyes. It was the entirety of a deer's central nervous system, meticulously stripped of flesh and removed from the body. I nearly vomited on the spot when I understood what I was looking at. I've butchered deer before, but I'd never seen anything like this before or since. It would take a master surgeon to do something with that much precision. I knew immediately that whatever had killed that buck left this here. It was a gift, a sign of appreciation for me letting it take the kill, an attempt at sharing the bounty. I don't know if the thing that took the deer knew what parts of it we ate. I packed up my campsite as quickly as possible and practically ran back to my truck. I haven't been hunting since. Everyone's heard of the Tow Witch in one way or another. Names will probably vary from city to city, country to country. The story is quite simple. Don't hang your feet out the bottom of the bed, or they will get gobbled up, chopped off, or something equally horrid. I grew up in a small village, miles from the nearest city. We had a school, local shops and markets, one doctor's surgery, no hospital, and a pub. Miles of forest surrounded our village, situated between two tall hills and a vast lake. Pretty ideal and beautifully picturesque. On occasion, we would get hardened hikers passing through, but apart from that, we were tucked away from the rest of the world. Most of the people were elderly. Younger families often move back to the village to raise children, and when they grow into adults, they would move to pursue a career. Few people stayed during their prime. My parents did the same. Mom moving to teach abroad, where she met my dad and moved back here to have me and my sister. I did the same when I grew up. Not much went on in the village. There was lots of gossip floating around between the neighbors, but that's expected. Most people got on well and invited each other for barbecues and bonfires. One thing that everyone agreed on, however, was the Tow Witch. The village believed the land was to blame. Resting between the forests, our little patch of land led to the perfect hiding place for a witch many years ago. Some people speculated that her bones were buried deep beneath our homes. Others thought she cursed the village to make sure she would always return, whatever happened. They believed she was still there. The story goes that the Tow Witch slept or lived under your bed during the night. She waited for you to pop out a foot, and she would crawl out, bite off a toe or two, and go back into hiding. The stories varied depending on who you spoke to, each with its own plot holes and gory new detail. I don't know whether I believed in the Tow Witch before that night. I probably did, being only 10. So why did all my family and most people I knew have all their toes? Well, we were prepared. Each bed in each house had posts. A net or curtain would be draped around the bed, and as an extra precaution, tucked under the mattress. That's what my parents did anyway. I bet every house had their own little method to keep her at bay. The only time the witch was mentioned between the neighbors was one of those nights around the bonfire, stories and hushed whispers. Another, and the times I remember most, was when I was tucked into bed and my parents kissed my head. "Good night, don't let the toe witch bite." Weird, probably. I was a kid, so it felt pretty normal to me. Anyway, I don't think I lost much sleep over it. There wasn't many empty houses in the village, but there was a few, and they sat in urgent need of care and attention, rotting into the ground. One day, however, a van pulled up. A large white van, far too new and pristine to be here where everything was mud and wellies. Men in overalls began hauling in ladders and paint, setting up cement mixers, and carrying huge panels of wood. I remember my mom twitching the curtains in our front room and beckoning my dad over. The phone rang off the hook as all the neighbors were doing the same. That night, we hosted a bonfire and the conversation was only about the potential new neighbors. I don't remember exactly what was said, just a lot about how they couldn't buy it. There must have been some law to stop them, going to the council, that kind of thing. I remember hoping they had children, preferably my age. I was quite excited. Months passed, my village fought it as far as they could, but soon enough, the new neighbors moved into their new beautiful home, which stood out a mile from the others with its picket fence and rose bushes. I don't know much about what happened next. My village was a friendly one, and we did our best to welcome our new neighbors. Nothing they could do now, they'd moved in, I guessed. The family joined us on walks and gatherings. They had 2 sons, one my age, and an older one my sister followed around like a lost sheep, flicking her hair, giggling really high-pitched. I'd stand behind him when she was there, pulling kissing faces so she'd go bright red. The usually annoying sibling stuff. All seemed good for a few weeks. They moved in the height of winter. Duck feather duvets and heated blankets were a must, and they complained a lot about the cold and the lack of road access in the snow. Yeah, they were pretty much stuck. We were used to it, but they obviously didn't expect it. The villagers told them about the legends surrounding the witch. I heard my dad telling my mom they had a conversation about it at the pub. Mom mentioned it when the neighbor's mom came for coffee. Neighbors told them at our bonfires. Each time they laughed it off. The mom told her boy not to worry, as they were just stories. This made one of the older villagers cross. He told her not to dismiss these legends and raves about how they need to respect the elders of the land if they wanted to be a part of our community. Something like that. I don't remember much, but I remember the tension as everyone turned in for an early night. They must have thought that we were crazy. The boy and his big brother asked me and my sister one eve about the witch. No, we'd never seen her. Yes, we had all our toes. Yes, we sleep with curtains on our bed like royalty. No, we don't have proof other than one old man that has 2 toes on 1 foot. They seemed unimpressed by our answers, but continued to pry. I didn't know what to tell them. I was young, and hadn't really been questioned about this before. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. Just don't put your feet outside the bed. What's the problem? A few nights later, when the boy and I played in my room, he told me about the plan he and his brother had come up with. They were going to set up a video recorder, prop it on the windowsill, and sleep with 1 foot out of the bed. I felt anxious. Told him he couldn't do that, but he shrugged it off. I didn't know what to do. After he left, I did the most noble thing and told my mom. She frowned, scrunched her nose, and asked me if they were both going to do it. What an odd question. Yes, I answered. She smiled. That's fine. The witch only comes when you're alone, and went back to washing up. The boy couldn't wait to show me his toes and tell me he was a survivor the next morning. His older brother just rolled his eyes and told him he wasn't a survivor because there wasn't anything he survived. It wasn't real. I shrugged and went back to whatever I was playing when my sister came into the room. It won't happen when someone else is there. She leant up the door frame. I shot a glare at her. The older brother laughed. Of course it won't. Should have known. After they'd left, I asked her what she thought she was doing. Apparently he deserved it. She added no context and walked off. Don't mess with my sister, boys. The next day we were all awoken by screams and slamming doors. My mom ran downstairs in her dressing gown, followed by my dad pulling on his slippers. They opened the front door and were met with my new friend's mom running around holding her head and the dad trailing behind, carrying his oldest son. Blood pooled whenever he stood still, staining the white snow with a thick, red gloop pouring from him. A sickly feeling built in the pit of my stomach. I looked at the dripping rag tied around him. I don't think much about why he was hurt at the time. It was all a bit of a blur. Dad sprang into action and ran to wake the doctor and helped take the boy to the surgery. Mom threw me and the neighbor's son into our house and shut the door. We sat there on the carpet, his face pale and vacant. It was then that I felt the overwhelming dread of what might have happened to him. Was it her? I asked. He nodded. I thought of how much blood there was. I didn't realize a toe could bleed like... She took his leg. The boy interrupted, deep in thought. To the knee. He didn't cry. He barely moved. Then he looked at me. What is it? I asked. He reached into his coat and pulled out a video camera. So big on him, I don't know how he hid it. I need to see her. He began to open the camera. No. I grabbed it from him. You've seen enough. The boy grabbed it back and we scuffed. No, he screamed. We need to know. This can't go on. We can stop her. My heroic child brain was too shocked to argue. The boy looked almost animal. I nodded softly as he opened the camera and pressed play. We skipped a few hours of footage. First was a lot of him turning, sitting up, checking the bed. Then he stopped still. He had obviously fallen asleep. About an hour after, we saw something. Stop there. Rewind. The boy stopped, rewound, and pressed play. Something moved slowly under the frame of the bed, a sort of scraping from one side of the frame, all the way to the other. After a minute, the thing began to crawl up the large wooden bed frame. It stretched out. It was a hand, fingers crudely bent at unnatural angles, too long to function properly, wiggling and writhing in different directions. An arm next, bony and bent. Another arm identical to the first grew from under the bed. Both the arms stretched wide to the sides of the double bed, holding on to the posts. When in place, the thing hoisted itself up. A head emerged next, pointed cheekbones and sunken black eyes. The head turned all the way around, assessing its surroundings and snapping unnatural movements. I was too scared not to look. I was frozen. So was my friend next to me. I don't know what we expected in our moments of shock and confusion, but it wasn't this. The gigantic arms allowed it to pull its body out from under the darkness. The body that emerged was long and pale. There were no legs. The body was almost snake-like, but the skin more human. The head slowly made its way to his brother, who still slept, not moving. The witch began to open its mouth. Its head snapped back, swinging from one side to another. She opened her jaw to release a long tongue. Her whole body seemed so unnatural and uncomfortable, like she didn't have control of the clunky movements. She dropped her head, seeming too heavy to hold upright. to the side and lowered herself to the bed, shifting towards his foot. The angle of her head made it difficult to see what was happening, but we knew. A minute went by until there was a crunch. He didn't wake. She moved up and the crunch came again, yet he slept. Her head flopped to the other side so we could see more of what was happening. Its mouth was open so wide its eyes were facing up to the ceiling while her jaw, unhinged, rested on the bed. This happened twice more until he twitched. It froze for a second. He moved again, his brow frowning and a tear trickling down his face. In an instant, like when you let go of a balloon, the thing whipped back, hitting the bed frame, the dressing table, and bouncing backwards off the set of drawers as if being sucked in from below. It wasn't seconds after that he began to scream, lifting his bloodied stump off the bed, blood spurting everywhere, and his mom bursting in, clasping her hands to her mouth in horror. As I stared, I was sure I could still see a long, curled finger hiding under the bed, just before the camera turns off. You see my friend run in and retrieve it before being ushered out by his dad. I looked at my friend, his eyes fixed on the small square screen. I told him it was real, he said. He didn't believe you all. I didn't know what to say. The whole day was a blur. It wasn't the only incident, just the first one from my memory, and surprisingly, the family continued to live there. The whole ordeal is, however, what inspired me to become a writer and researcher, exploring myths and legends around the world. I can assure you that many of the locations I've visited, I've found no truth of the myths that supposedly reside there, but some of them have proven to be far more creepier and far more disturbing than our tow witch. A few months back, I moved in a town in the southern part of the United States. I wanted to move to this town since it was much closer to my job. I work at a storage facility warehouse that lies between the nearby major city and the meridional town that I moved to. My options for residence were either in the city, which wasn't something I'd enjoy or search for since I dislike the city life. The constant sounds of construction, blaring car horns, and barking dogs weren't something I'd be interested in. A small southern town, somewhere quiet, sounded like a much more appealing place to live. While I was looking for houses for sale, my selection of houses was quite limited, as not many people here are looking to sell their houses. With that being said, there were only 2 houses that were up for grabs. One of the houses was close to the center of the town, though when I did my walkthrough of it, I was, well, let's just say, not impressed. The other house, though, looked much more appealing, but the location wasn't the best. The house itself butted right up next to one of the mini farms that dotted in the area, thus making the house seem much more isolated. The rows of nearby cornfields created a sort of natural wall around the entire property. That was the first thing I noticed about the house as I pulled off the main road and onto the driveway. I never really enjoyed the thought of living out in the sticks, but tried to look at the bright side. The peace and quiet would be a big plus, as well as not having to worry about anyone bothering me. I met with the realtor, and after an hour or so of looking at the house, I pulled out all the necessary paperwork, and by the end of the month, I was completely moved in. The house itself wasn't very large. It was a basic single-story 3-bedroom house. That being said, it was more than enough for me, especially considering the fact that I lived alone. Although the exterior of the house, at a glance, seemed somewhat weathered, the interior, on the other hand, was fully remodeled, which was a major selling point for me. I quickly got settled in, and before I knew it, the house began to feel more like home. Days went by fast, seemingly melding into weeks. I'd gotten myself into a routine which aided in the time progressing faster, and before I knew it, summer months seemed like a distant memory. As the fall weather showed up, despite me living in the south, it was still on the northern end of the state, which resulted in cooler weather and fallen leaves. During autumn, I often thought back to my times as a child, running around in various costumes, trick-or-treating with friends, and shoveling mountains of candy in my mouth. The 1st of October had arrived, and I was on my way home from work when I spotted something odd regarding my neighbor's farm. It seemed like the owners were having some sort of bird problem, as a newly placed scarecrow loomed partially above the cornfield. I could just vaguely make out the outline of a body suspended in the air as the headlights of my truck passed over it. Looking out of my passenger side window, I could still see the dark outline of the scarecrow in the distance. As I glanced at the scarecrow, I could swear for the briefest of moments that I saw it move slightly. When I refocused my eyes, however, it seemed stationary. I figured that work had simply taken its toll on my mind. I arrived home not long after and called it a night. The next morning, when I was walking to my truck to head to work, I looked towards the cornfield. I could see the scarecrow much more clearly now as the sun shone down brightly on it despite the cloudy and overcast sky above. It was quite a distance away from my house, so I could only see the upper torso through the cornfield. What I could see of it seemed quite ragged, as if someone had taken decade-old clothes and aimlessly sewn them together. Straw shot up and out from its neck and wrists, giving its silhouette a jagged appearance. I couldn't exactly make out what its face looked like, though, since I had no time to further examine it as I had to leave for work. A week had passed by without an issue, and each day, as I'd head out to my truck, I'd spot the scarecrow still and silently doing its job. Even though the scarecrow had been out there for a couple of days, my mind thought back to earlier, and I hadn't noticed any birds around the crops themselves. It seemed like the scarecrow wasn't necessary, or maybe it was just really good at scaring birds away. Another consideration that came to mind was Halloween decoration, though I doubt any kids would come all the way out here to trick-or-treat. About a week and a half ago, I had noticed something strange about the scarecrow. I had the day off from work, so I spent that time doing chores and generally cleaning up my house. When I took the trash outside, I saw that the scarecrow had gotten significantly closer to my house. It was so noticeable that it took me by surprise when I saw it. It was now nearly on the edge of the cornfield. Now, I wondered if my neighbor had moved it for some reason. I wandered over to the edge of the cornfield where the scarecrow was perched up and scratched my chin as I stared up at it. I could see the face much better at this proximity. It had a brown burlap sack as a head with roughly stitched X's for eyes, and a small slit at the bottom, which seemed to be its mouth. Overall, it didn't seem like whoever made this thing put any effort into it. I then turned to walk away from it, and just as my head turned to face away from it, I heard the crackling sound of twigs behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around. But the scarecrow just sat there motionless as ever. I kept a constant watch on it as I made my way back to my house. 5 days ago, I was driving home after a late shift. As I rounded the corner onto my street, I could already see the cornfield growing in the distance. The entire field seemed to sway like grass would on a windy day. As I drove, I would occasionally take glances towards the field to see if I could spot the scarecrow, but I couldn't. As I pulled into the driveway, I angled my truck so the headlights would face the field in attempts to see if the scarecrow was actually gone, and much to my surprise, it was. I figured that maybe my neighbor had taken it down for some reason. As I sat there staring into the empty cornfield, I thought I could see some corn swaying away more than the rest, but I quickly disregarded it and went inside. 2 days ago is when something completely unexplainable happened. I had yet another day off from work. This time, instead of spending the day doing chores and cleaning, I spent the majority of the day watching movies and television. And before I knew it, the once morning sun had changed the sky into a dark, radiant shade of orange. As I sat on my sofa after a break of watching movies, I thought I heard a noise coming from my backyard. I got up and walked over to my back door and peeked out one of the windows. My eyes grew wide as I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Standing in the clearing of my backyard was that scarecrow. How was it standing on its own 2 legs was beyond me. Its feet were turned out the sides while its knees were slumped together. Its shoulders dropped down to lifeless-like arms which dangled at its sides. Its head was slanted to the right, as if it had no support from its neck. I just stood there, frozen in fear and utter confusion, staring at it as the twilight sky had succumbed to the night. As soon as the last rays of light faded in, I watched in horror as this thing started to twitch. Its body seemed to jostle and move slightly like the oncoming night was doing something to it. I turned away from the window for a moment to make sure my back door was locked. When I glanced back through the window once more, it was gone. I scanned as much as I could of my backyard with the little light outside, jolting my head quickly from left to right. The scarecrow was gone. I stood there trying to rationalize that my mind was playing tricks on me, that ever since I saw that scarecrow, it had been subconsciously stuck inside my head, causing me to have some sort of hallucination. I walked through the house, double-checking to make sure all my doors were locked and windows tightly fastened. I could feel my body slowly start to become tired and sluggish, and I decided that it was time for bed. Nearly 3 hours after I had fallen asleep, I was suddenly awoken by a noise coming from my kitchen. It sounded like something had gotten knocked off my kitchen counter. I quickly sat up in a daze and walked out into my living room. My legs stiffened as I saw the silhouette of a person standing in my kitchen. Once my eyes adjusted to the darkness of my house, I could see the bits of hay sticking out of its neck and torso. The scarecrow had somehow gotten inside of my house. I could feel my throat tighten and my hands become shaky as I stared, frozen in fear, as it took fast, shuffling steps towards me. The crunch of hay under its weight made my skin crawl. As it approached, its mouth began to open. The small line that had been cut into the burlap seemed to extend. Inside was a twirling mass of worms and maggots that seemed to crawl out and onto its face. Through the insects, I could see what vaguely resembled teeth. Though they were completely black and spaced apart, they kind of looked like shark teeth. It raised its limp arm towards me and continued its advance. As if my body were on autopilot, my legs seemed to slowly inch backwards. I wasn't sure what to do, as I couldn't even think clearly in the moment. Its gloved hands rested up on my shoulders, and it brought its open and small mouth right to my face, some of the worms and maggots spilling onto my face and chest. Feeling them crawling sent a jolt up my body, bringing my arms up to shove this thing away. When I did, it snapped its teeth at me like a snapping turtle. I braced my legs and pushed even harder, which broke me free of its grasp. I turned away from it and ran to my front door, making sure to grab my keys and wallet from the coffee table nearby. As I ran, I swatted off the bugs, until I could no longer feel that prickly sensation of them crawling on me. I made it safely to my car, and when I started it, my headlights turned on. In the open doorway of my home, I could see that scarecrow still standing there completely still. I backed out of my driveway and drove all the way into town. I found a hotel to stay at for the time being, and I've been here ever since. Yesterday I drove back to the house during the day to investigate. There was absolutely no sign of the scarecrow. Even the worms and maggots that were once on the floor of my kitchen were gone. What was even more odd was when I inspected the back door. I found that the back door was still locked. Everything inside of my house was locked aside from my front door, which I had unlocked to escape. I have no idea how that thing managed to get inside of my house. I drove over to my neighbor's house shortly after, and an old man answered the door. I inquired about the scarecrow that he had put up in his field, though he only returned a confused expression. When I asked about it, he said he hadn't put any scarecrow up in his field whatsoever. Completely confused, I apologized for bothering him and left. I'm not sure where that scarecrow came from, or why it targeted me. If any of you out there see a random scarecrow in a field, leave it alone, and get as far away from it as possible. My sister-in-law Jennifer hates me. I avoid her like the plague, but she usually goes out of her way to pull me into every conversation just to pick on every word I say. I stopped going to family gatherings at my in-laws because I couldn't take the abuse anymore. The worst part is my husband Brian says it's my fault. He says I have to stop taking things so personally, and that this is just the way Jennifer is. But when I point out she's not like this to anybody else, he says I'm too sensitive. He says I'm jealous of her because she's attractive. I couldn't help being hurt and annoyed by this, and my face showed it. I'm not good at hiding emotions. Brian knew he had hurt me and then went in for the kill. With a perfectly straight face, he looked at me in the eye and said he couldn't stand perfect girls like Jennifer anyway because he couldn't relax around her at all. There's something off about her, he said. You know what I mean. And the funny thing was, I knew exactly what he meant. Brian was right. Jennifer was perfect. She was genetically blessed, intelligent, successful, and I have never seen her with so much as a hair out of place. Brian's brother Billy, Jennifer's husband, on the other hand, got mixed up with the wrong crowd when he was younger and barely finished high school, but he's been sober for 5 years and is the nicest guy I know. I like him a lot, but Brian says he has no ambition. Anyway, after several months of not seeing my in-laws, I got a text one day from Billy asking me how I was doing. Truth to tell, I was really flattered he thought of me. I texted him back that I was fine, and he asked me if I was going to his mother's birthday party next week. He said I should come, and I was like, I'll think about it. It felt very high school, but in a good way, because I did miss seeing Billy. He was the only one in the family who defended me from Jennifer when my own husband couldn't be bothered. Brian seemed pissed when I told him I wanted to go to his mom's birthday party. He said I was not invited because Jennifer refused to be in the same room as me. I asked him why, and he was like, you know why. I was genuinely confused and said I had no idea what he was talking about. And then he said Jennifer said I called her the B word, and that I told her she would never be able to have children because she worked out too much. What? I would never say anything so cruel to her or to anybody. I never even saw her in at least 2 months, and Brian knew this. But of course, Brian didn't believe me, and said he would throw me out himself if I dared showed up at the party. Brian wouldn't tell me when the party was, but Billy let me know. I got to Brian's mom's house just in time, and Jennifer was so surprised when she saw me she almost dropped her food. She gave Brian a look, and he shrugged as if to say he did all he could do to keep me away. The party was a nightmare. If Jennifer was a B word before, now she was going for my jugular. I have rosacea, and am very sensitive about my skin, and Jennifer knew this. All throughout dinner, she kept asking me why I was so red. I can't help it. What I had been drinking, I don't drink, and held up a cherry tomato next to my face and asked everybody which was redder. When Billy told her to cut it out, Brian told him to shut up and that I deserved it. I had never seen Billy look so angry before, and for a second I thought he was going to hit Brian. Brian smirked all throughout dinner because the meaner Jennifer was to me, the sweeter she was to him. I was on the verge of tears and I excused myself to go to the bathroom to wash my face. When I came out into the hall, Jennifer was waiting for me. She looked extremely upset. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, forcing me back into the bathroom. She grabbed me by the hair and I could feel her wet, smelly breath on my face. She might have been beautiful, but her mouth stank like a sewer. "Stay away," she spat into my ear. "Do you hear me? Stay away." From behind her I saw Brian, and he was watching us with a smile on his face. Jennifer let go of me and walked past him and out of the bathroom. "I told you not to come," Brian said. Billy texted me the next day to ask me if I was okay. It's hard to know what to say to a man whose wife had just beat me up in his own mother's bathroom, and I was embarrassed because I liked Billy a lot, and I hated that he saw me humiliated, so I left him on red. I ignored his text, and it was the biggest mistake of my life because who knows what might have happened if I had only talked to him. Instead, I went to stay with my new work friend Heidi, who offered me her couch. I couldn't sleep and was stalking Jennifer's social media when Heidi looked over my shoulder and said Jennifer looks a lot like a woman who went missing from her hospital a few years ago. Heidi said it was a car accident. Rainy night, wet roads, a truck and SUV, head-on collision. The people in the truck walked away with barely a bruise, but the driver of the SUV died on impact. The woman who was in the car with him was pregnant and ended up having a miscarriage in the ambulance. They brought her into the hospital where Heidi was working, and she told Heidi the man who had died was her fiancé and that they were on their way to get married. When Heidi went back to check on her, she was gone. The woman had, apparently, walked out of the hospital. Nobody knew where she went. Nobody even knew her name. When they figured out who the dead guy was, it turned out he was already married. His wife lived 2 states over and thought he was visiting his parents. Anyway, Heidi said, it all happened years ago, and who even knows if it's the same woman. Brian had told me about the car accident. It was him, Billy and their parents in Billy's truck, and Brian was driving. They walked away with minor injuries, but the driver of the other car died. It happened before we were married, and it was in fact how Brian and I met. But Brian had never mentioned the woman in the other car, and I had never connected her with Jennifer. If Heidi was wrong, then I would look crazy if I confronted Jennifer about it, and Jennifer, being Jennifer, would never let me live it down. She would tell everybody what a nut job I am, and I would never be able to show my face in front of Billy again. But if Heidi was right? And here, my mind ran into a brick wall. I texted Billy, and when he didn't reply, I called him. I left him a message that I wanted to talk to him and waited, and waited. It had only been a day, and I told myself that I was freaking out over nothing, and so I waited another day and obsessively scrolled through everybody's social media. There was going to be a barbecue at Brian's mom's house, and Brian, Billy, and Jennifer were going to be there. Jennifer had commented under the barbecue post that she was going to bring the meat, and Brian said it better be good, and they exchanged smiley faces. Billy still hadn't replied to me. I had to work late and ended up not making it to the barbecue until evening. When I got to Brian's mom's house, the first thing I thought was that something smells delicious. Jennifer was going back and forth with plates, and Brian and his parents were sitting around looking happy and fed. When I came in, Jennifer was just bringing in the last dish. It was big and round and covered with a silver dome. When she saw me, her face fell and she said, "What the hell are you doing here?" There was an awkward silence. "Get out," she said. "Leave now." But I wasn't going to leave until I talked to Billy. "Where's Billy?" I said. She said nothing. "What's that dish?" Brian's mom said. "I can't eat another bite." "Dessert," said Jennifer, still looking at me. She put down the dish carefully and walked towards me. She went for my arm, but I dodged her grasp. Brian's mother said, "Let her stay. We're almost done." "Get out," Jennifer hissed at me as we played cat and mouse in a corner of the yard. "Tell me where Billy is," I said. "He's gone," she said. I was stunned. "He left you?" That didn't sound like something Billy would do. Brian and his parents were standing around the big covered dish. From what I could hear, Brian's mother was trying to get everybody focused on the dish, rather than on her two daughter-in-laws fighting in her yard. Jennifer kept pushing me away from where the others were standing around the dish. "Where is Billy?" I said. "Where did he go?" But Jennifer only kept saying, "Go away, get out," over and over again. She pushed and I pushed back. She was strong, but I was strong too, as I was finding out. Jennifer gave me a final hard shove, saying, "Run, you fool." She hit me hard on the face, and I hit her back. I saw Brian lifting the dome covering the big dish. There was a moment of dead silence, and then Brian's mother screamed and fainted as Jennifer jumped on me and pushed me to the ground, covering my body with hers as I heard a loud explosion and the ground shook beneath me. The police said a shrapnel went into the back of Jennifer's head, killing her on impact. The others survived, but all had serious injuries they would never completely recover from. Brian's mother had to be put into a straitjacket in the ICU. At Billy and Jennifer's house, every inch of the floor and walls had been smeared with blood. She had dismembered him as expertly as a butcher, and the flesh had been chopped and grounded and brought to the family barbecue where it was cooked and eaten. The head was stuffed with explosives and put into the last dish with the wiring hooked up to the dome covering it. As for me, I was completely unharmed thanks to Jennifer protecting me with her body. She had sacrificed herself to save me, believing me to be innocent. Grief makes a person do funny things, like the grief that comes from finding out your husband betrayed you. That when he said he was visiting his parents, he was really going on a road trip with his mistress. When they came out of the motel room, it was already dark and all I could see of the woman were shiny stilettos under a big umbrella as they got into the SUV. I was desperate to know what she looked like, and so I followed them in my rental car. The night was dark and it was raining and I stayed close so I didn't lose them. I saw the back of her head leaning on his shoulder as he drove, and then I saw, or I thought I saw, him putting an arm around her. And because grief makes a person do funny things, I gave the steering wheel a hard jerk, pulling my car right into the path of a truck coming the other way. I remember the truck's headlights and then the screech of brakes behind me as I, seemingly miraculously, drove on untouched. Nobody saw me. Nobody even suspected there was another car there that night. Or so I thought. When the police came to the house and told me my husband died in a car accident, I couldn't even pretend to be surprised. But they were clearly just going through the steps and I didn't take much notice. It was, as far as they were concerned, an open and shut case. They told me there was a woman in the car with him and that she had disappeared after the accident. They asked me if I knew who she might be, and I told them truthfully I did not. The motel she and my husband stayed at were registered under my husband's name. Not long afterwards, a man showed up on my doorstep. He said his name was Brian and that he and his brother and parents had recently been in an accident. The accident that killed my husband. At first, I thought he had come to offer his condolences, but the expression on his face told me otherwise. He then told me he knew I was there that night, and made it clear that he knew it was my car that had caused the accident. He said he had a proposition for me. He wanted to marry me. His sneering demeanor made it plain that this proposition had nothing to do with love. I asked him if it was for my husband's life insurance, and he said the money was part of it, but it wasn't all. I understood what he meant. Even the few minutes I'd spent in Brian's company told me prison and even death would be preferable to a marriage with him. Later, after our marriage, the little that Billy let drop about his childhood told me he had been Brian's new victim, until he got too big and strong for Brian to torture. When Brian found me, he immediately realized that his initial plan to blackmail me into submission was redundant. My life ended when my husband died, and every day since then had been a living hell, and my face showed it. What Brian offered me was release, or at least distraction, in the form of pain and humiliation, and I took it. The bomb had deprived Brian the use of his legs. He had despised physical weakness and disability of every kind, and now he was disabled himself. He, who had always wanted to be the villain in his own story, had turned out to be nothing more than a victim of circumstance, and as strange as this might sound, I felt nothing but pity for him. A few months after the accident, I received a visit from a man who said he was Jennifer's lawyer. He told me she had left me a letter to be opened after her death. Her death? When did she give it to you? I asked him. He said, I shouldn't really tell you, but I suppose it can't matter much now. She gave it to me the day before she died. Shouldn't you give this to the police then? I said. What makes you think I didn't? He said, Is your husband around? He's sleeping. I said, He sleeps a lot these days. He isn't what he used to be. I heard sirens in the distance coming closer. Ours were a quiet night, and I wondered if there had been an accident somewhere. This is what Jennifer's letter to me said. I'm sorry. I loved him once too, so I know how you feel. When I found out he was married and had been lying to me all along, I promised myself he would pay. When the accident with the truck happened, I saw my chance and killed him with a rock. It was easy. The police didn't suspect me, but Billy knew. He saw me do it. Billy found me and told me what he saw. He wanted to save me, not turn me into police. I told him I didn't want to be saved. I wanted to burn in hell. I tell him I will kill him so fast if he goes to the police, but he refused to be scared. I tell him all day long what I am, but he'll only tell me I am really good inside. He would only see the best in people, even me. And then Brian somehow figured out what Billy saw and threatened to go to the police if I didn't do whatever he tells me. Billy married me so he couldn't be made to testify against me, but Brian still kept hinting he could get me sent to prison without Billy's help. I told Billy his brother is talking, but who knows? Maybe he did have something. But I played along with Brian because he was amusing. He believed every stupid thing I tell him like a baby. He thinks I am his to do with what he wants. He's very wrong. I will fry him like a stick of butter. I didn't kill Billy. When Brian came over to the house and tried to sleep with me, Billy pulled him off and Brian pushed him down the stairs. I told Brian I would take care of the body, but I didn't tell him how. I guess he will be surprised. The baby monitor Billy had set up for our cats also recorded Brian pushing him down the stairs, and I'm having that sent to the police. So if Brian survives the bomb, I hope he has the taste for prison food. About the birthday party of Brian's mother, I made a good plan. They were all going to be so blown away. Brian first. But you showed up and my work was wasted. I'm sorry I made you cry. You weren't supposed to be at the barbecue either. I tried my best to keep you away. None of this is your fault. Please don't feel sorry for me. I am so sick of this world. I regret nothing. Forgive me for everything. Jennifer.